the panel Human Collaboration and Machine Generation Across Media for the 2020 ICEA. Over the past 15 years, computational poet Nick Montfort, electronic fiction writer Scott Rettberg, and myself, Roderick Coover, filmmaker and media artist, have collaborated in different configurations to make works that use computers to tell our stories. Rather than trying to produce systems that mimic human intelligence, we created systems that perform the functions that computers do well, which is manipulating symbols and drawing from distributions. And in doing so, we've relied on each other's human sentience to collaboratively develop voices and visions that are overtly machinic, but which refigure human visual and textual elements. So, from a significant body of work, we'll be discussing 4 such projects, each of them collaboratively created. The first of these projects is 3 Rails Live, and here's a short sample to begin the discussions.
The possibility of the sleeping compartment, the mysterious stranger, the casual glance over the newspaper at the passenger across, the air of mystery. Secret agents almost always ride in trains. A whiff of perfume, a pillbox hat, a rhythmic landscape, the Freudian suggestion implicit. A martini in the dining car, a chance encounter. We always somehow expected that we would have an affair on the train, though we never properly arranged it before time ran out. She always knew that he would die in some idiotic way. She expected that it would be some sort of car crash or skiing accident, or some type of household incident involving a blender, or an electrical fire of some kind, maybe a heart attack at a steakhouse after he ordered something medium rare. But she never expected he would die of a snake bite, sort of a dramatic death, replete with metaphoric associations. She did not think he would die like that. He didn't know what to think. Is there some sort of anti-venom?
The moral of the story is, people who live in glass houses have a room with a view.
I don't believe in fate, no. But I don't really think that I'm the master of my own destiny. So many things have happened that I wouldn't have anticipated. I guess I think there's an invisible hand of some kind. A finger that flicks an avalanche or claps an earthquake into being. I don't think it's God, really, but some force that's beyond me. I don't feel like I'm the master of my own destiny. That's for sure. You belong to the landscape. You belong to your surroundings. You're just an organism like any other. People are no more significant than trees if you think about it. Just animals, an ecosystem. Sure, we have our impact on the world around us, but it'll outlast us. Maybe even regret we were ever here.
The moral of the story is, a fool and his money, sailor's delight.
Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
So what we've just been watching is 3 Rails Live. This was the first project that we did with all 3 of us together. Originally, the idea was that it would be a project that we could complete on the train between Philadelphia and Providence, Rhode Island. The way that it originated was Rod sent images back and forth to me and Nick, and we reacted differently to the images. I began to put the images into these sort of buckets and began to think about them thematically, and then to write short narrative responses to each of these images. Along the way, a sort of narrative began to cohere about sort of, one man's search for meaning among the detritus of his life. and it was an interesting time for me because I had recently broken my wrist and I was unable to type. So I actually wrote these stories by speaking to a text translations program, and then I felt driven to actually speak them myself back into the story. So we went with a generative structure, and I responded with narrative, but Nick took some of the same images or still images from the same set and reacted differently. Nick, would you like to?
Yeah. My perspective on this combinatorial project as we started to work out what it would be was how it was that the different ways that we engage with media and with concept could come together. How something that I could do that might be a very minimal type of involvement with the project, really, or a small bit of language at the beginning and end of these more involved and richer narrative units coming together, and the motion picture and the still image, how that could sort of activate the imagination. So a lot of my interest is in how very simple units of language, some would say minimal, but how very simple and straightforward units of language, when they're combined, can mean different things and lead us to think in different ways. So a title that could come up as something like empty glass, between glass, forgotten glass, trading glass, last glass. Actually, those change the meaning of the word glass, because between glass is like you're about to examine something in a microscope. Last glass, you're at a bar. Trading glass, you're industrial and you're working to do something in this commercial realm. And those types of frameworks are ones that I think are useful for this. The concluding moral to the story is sort of a handcrafted combination of the beginning and ending of different proverbs, which I was inspired by Harry Matthews' Selected Declarations of Dependence, where he used the perverb framework, one that's similar to this, to prompt him to write these sort of riddle-like short stories or descriptions, each of which is explained by one of these similar types of combinations. And I just like the nature of proverbs as being able to tell you exactly the opposite, you know, of another proverb. Each proverb can be answered by another. You can say, look before you leap, or you can say, he who hesitates is lost. And they can each give you these different perspectives and these different comments. So even though my eye isn't there the way Rod's is, and my voice isn't there the way Scott's is, I tried to make a contribution that would activate the rich combinations of media that each of them offered.
I guess another thing to say is that this follows up on a series of films that Rod and I did called the Catastrophe Trilogy, where we began to be very concerned with these sort of cycles. So the cycle structure of repetition of Three Rails Live fits into these cycles of forgetting. Here you can see a diagram of how the combinatory engine actually works. Most of the elements are generated, and the juxtapositions between image and text in each section are essentially arbitrary. They're kind of pulling out of a bucket. And this creates an interesting effect where we have this effect of closure when we watch them, whether the closure is there actually or not. You might be hearing one text that's referencing an image that you saw 3 cycles back. So it's surprising in a way how coherent we actually end up with. And later on in the programming, we ended up making it so that it doesn't repeat, so that you do get a kind of complete experience of a narrative for 45 minutes.
I remember when it all began, at least when it really started to get worse. I was just a kid when the big floods started. There had always been flooding, of course, but not the big ones that take out roads and rewrite shorelines. When the real storms started coming, all of them hurricanes, one after the other, all these places that had never flooded before were getting hit. I used to spend a lot of time down in the basement. Money was tight in the recession, and sometimes Mom and Dad would argue, and it seemed like a safe place. I remember one night I was down there painting things, scenes of things like I sometimes did, listening to the rain, and the walls cracked. The foundation fractured and the water seeped through. The water had a strange smell to it, and it got worse and worse over time. There was a lot of mopping. Finally, the walls and floors came off kilter, and tiles and things came off, floorboards coming off and stuff. By the time the inspector said we had to move, the house itself was at a strange angle, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa or something.
By the mid-teens, nearly everyone agreed that spending on FEMA was way out of control, and that they needed to be put on a leash. I mean, the whole budget can't be disaster relief when you've got 4, 5, 6 canes tearing up the coast every year. You can't bail everyone out every time a storm hits. Sometimes it's like tough luck, you know? You should have built on high ground, right? They ran out of other people's money, and then they ran out of trailers. They ran out of rations, and that's when things really got complicated.
Michelle from Oceanside was a 44-year-old single mother of 2 who loved animals. Her 19-year-old daughter and 22-year-old son were away when she was found a week after the storm dead in her home along with her 3 pets, a labradoodle named Zoe, a cat named Skittles, and a bird named Lila. The animals were also dead. Neighbors mentioned that in the immediate aftermath of the storm, she had generously welcomed them to use her little generator to charge their phones.
They still name the storms: Hurricane Danny, Tropical Storm Erica, Hurricane Fred. They recycle the list every 6 years, but they retire the names of particularly memorable storms, like Tess and Benjamin. They've been retiring a lot of them the last few years. I was down in Tom's River supervising a cleanup operation for Hurricane Marco when Omar hit and flooded the Schuylkill. It was a strange path, and people didn't expect that it would hit the Philly metro area the way that it did. My boy's school was in the path. The roof of the cafeteria caved in and he was trapped under a beam. They were able to save him, but it...
So we've just been looking at a short
spine.
Sequence from the Project
places.
Toxicity climate change narrative.
He'll never walk again.
And this is a combinatorial film that follows 6
difficult.
characters living in a near future when floods have transformed the industrial estuaries of the Delaware River, the coast of New Jersey, coast of Pennsylvania, Delaware. And people are, in a sense, offering oral histories from the future from this landscape. These are set against a whole series of, in a way, chorus accounts of actual obituaries of how people died during Hurricane Sandy. Now, the way this all came about, initially I'd been kayaking along the Delaware River, and I started gathering images of the industrial wasteland, wondering what would happen as floods would wash over these landscapes. And I started mapping those, and this already gave me a kind of disjuncted, connect the dots experience to what I was seeing, kind of building up a scrapbook of accounts, of pictures, going out and taking walks along those shorelines that I'd been kayaking along, and beginning to piece together in a way fragmentary stories. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to work with those. Part of it was documentary, creating logs, creating a kind of play on this sort of observational recordings of the 19th century and thinking of how that could be replayed in a 21st century context to address what were the consequences of all this industrialization and the logic of the Industrial Revolution, which was living with climate change. And so it was there that I was beginning to think how to create a project. And so at that point, I turned to Scott and said, well, what about working with this narratively? And I think Scott then, he picked it up and started to develop narrative threads.
Yeah, so when Rod handed me this set of materials, the research that he had done, some of the images of the kayaking, we began to talk about to sort of return to the cycles of catastrophe. We elected to go with a kind of a speculative narrative structure where there would be a series of voices, each of which sort of represent a different type of perspective, from a sort of right-wing pig farmer to a kid who loses his mother in the incident to a female worker. At the same time as we started developing this, Hurricane Sandy hit New York and New Jersey, including the town where I used to live right before I moved to Norway. And that town, Brigantine, was pretty devastated by this storm. So that's when I became interested in this idea of sort of mixing the fact and the fiction. And I essentially read all of the obituaries of everyone who died in New Jersey during Hurricane Sandy, and then adapted them and integrated them as part of the film in a sort of almost like a fugue-like structure, but also a series of waves that come and go forth. And I think this creates a kind of sense of disorientation, and it uses the combinatory structure in a much different way than we had used it before in Three Rails Live. Were you going to say something, Ron?
Yeah, so part of then working with that was creating these layers of images that had that same sense of infusing fact and fiction. And we talked a lot about that, and working in this very wide scale also did that. We had this kind of panoramic vision, and in which we could kind of layer snippets of pieces on top of the experience, which works great for huge projection, where you become, in a sense, immersed in the floods. And I think that was also then part of our feeling, and the combinatory structure has that, because it feels like each set of stories is like a wave crashing, and it kind of shuffles up the stories, and here's one reality, and the tide comes and the waves crash, and you're in another set of stories, and each version of reality is valid, and yet they're always shifting.
And on any given run of the film, you never hear the, you will hear different death stories, because there's about, I forget how many, but I think there's about 30 of those stories in the database that's used to generate the film. Soren Pold, who's a literature and digital culture scholar, has done a really nice job of writing about these effects in this work in his book, The Meta Interface. So that's a bit of reading that I'd highly recommend, coming from someone from the authors, other than the authors. And I don't know if we're getting close to the point where we want to talk
a little bit about the structure.
So the structure, I think we have a diagram here somewhere, but essentially the structure has our title sequence, has a beginning sequence, and then we have a masked image and an unmasked image that coheres to two different types of story clips, and then a death chorus. And we sort of mixed up the structure a number of different times for different exhibition situations, but this would be sort of the 45-minute version, where we get this sort of repetition. We can do different things because it's a database. So for example, sometimes we've had the story focus more on given characters than others, and sometimes that happens arbitrarily. Sometimes we design a sort of 10-minute experience rather than a 45-minute experience. But 45 minutes gets you to most of the narrative threads in different orders each time.
Yep. Next up, we're going to look at a short example from the work Penelope, which is generative and combinatory poetry experience. And that's by Alejandro Albornoz, myself, and Scott Rettberg.
I would slit the throat of our finest boar. In simple handiwork, memories forget. I would shed all these visions I deplore. My fingers cut on threads of empty net. Nothing to feed our maidens but rotting bait. When the last great cat has finally purred, nothing for the cock that crowed too late. If you lie dead, I'd have your bones interred. For swamps and bogs where hopeless bodies float, wash shrouded intentions and make them plain. All epics, histories which fate rewrote, swim as if I true to you yet remain. We can't sweep away this soil with a broom. Our cupboards empty as a barren womb. Swim gossamer threads uncoiled from the skein. All daggers that would slit my threatened throat. Wash my yearning lips, wet my tongue profane. For refugees crowded on stranded boat, if we can't see clearly, our vision blurred, nothing fertile in this abandoned state. When silence is my lover's only word. Nothing for our livestock, no partners to mate. My man will be another woman's pet. I would render tame a restless centaur. In fulfillment of a prophetic bat. I would sit a vigil at Hades' door.
So we just saw Penelope, which is a combinatory sonnet generator film. This is in part inspired by the combinatory poem 100,000 Billion Poems by Raymond Queneau. And that was a work where you had a series of sonnets that were cut into strips rather than pages, and you could recombine a sonnet in a bunch of different ways, creating new works every time. Rod and I each had a fellowship, so we'd won an award where we got fellowships to Kefalonia in Greece. So we sort of decided to shoot something there. And that's where I kind of came to the idea of doing something with Penelope. And I was also trying to integrate some language about mass extinction, about sort of contemporary human concerns as well. So we'll talk a bit about the structure later, but it's a sort of much different use of the combinatory structure than what we saw in the two previous examples. This sort of harkens back in a way to earlier work. The other thing that we did that was new was integrating work by a friend of ours who's a composer. So there was this challenge of integrating a generated musical soundtrack as well in the film, in addition to the voice tracks.
We were just doing it at the time there was a migration crisis developing in Europe, and we were already addressing issues of climate change and the fragility of the environment and what washes up on the shores. And it was very interesting to bounce back and forth between an ancient story and look at the evolution of motifs from a long time back, playing with the Odyssey, looking across at Ithaca across the waters, looking at all of these elements that you could find in the ancient stories, and finding, meanwhile, the rubble of a contemporary time, the trash washing up on the beaches, signs of people passing across this environment through different times. So we're really therefore gathering all of these sets of images that would resonate with the text. And because the text is generated, there's a constant shifting of how images and text work together, and they're getting all mixed up. And so the play of that was to find very clear sets of images that worked as kind of little motifs, and then shuffle them all together and let the language take them over and the sounds take them over, which is really a fun process, an exciting process.
Another really interesting thing about the soundtrack, sort of in the background, is that all of the songs or musical motifs that Alejandro created were from one single orchestra oboist, who viewed some of the text and some of the images, and then responded to them sort of improvisationally and emotionally. And then he, using digital techniques, turned those into much more complicated compositions that I think really add a lot, in addition to the spoken voice actor who worked with the text. And of course, these sort of resonant images of a couple of figures who might be Penelope, who might be Odysseus, or who might just be sort of representative figures in general. A couple words just about the structure of Penelope, which is quite a bit different. We here we're integrating both sort of generated combinations of video. In addition, the system selects the lines of the poem from arrays where there's sort of 5 different possibilities for every position of the line in the poem. The ambient soundtrack is also selected from an array, so there's a very complex layering that occurs. And also, as we move through the process for rhythm and things like that, we integrated ambient audio.
So we've just looked at a 3-minute segment of what's generally a 15-minute experience in live performance, or one of continually changing set of 3-minute experiences for mobile media. That is, this work was designed first and foremost as a large immersive experience for installations, also something you can watch following your Google Map to specific locations where there'd be headsets put on that would put the experience in different settings, in this case around West Philadelphia. So the work is designed to work both ways. It's all created in 360. It follows research on the industrial wasteland, a lot of the research that had already been developed with toxicity, to ask questions about the language of industrialization and the legacies we live in, with the idea that you can't alter our concept of climate change, the conditions we have, without addressing the paradigms that endure in the language of that time. So that's where I turned to Nick, thinking about how to work on this topic, and to Adam Vidixis, and thinking about how we could work with generative structures and to address language and work in this space. Maybe Nick, you'd like to take it on from here?
Sure. So the language is generated language here. And it's really quite opposite to the way that I tried to generate the very simple and highly legible titles and sort of handcraft these combined perverbs or morals to the story in 3 Rails Live. So in those systems, you can't help but read, if you're attending to the project at all, you can't help but read the language that's there. And in this project, I think it's almost impossible to read, not only because it moves in this rush, in this flow or flood, which is inspired certainly by Rod and Scott's earlier work on toxicity and Rod's work on waterways and the material and subject matter of the current project. But also because it ranges between these different modes. So the basic idea of the text generation is just that the text is in a certain state and it can rise to a higher, more rapid and more linguistically complex state, or it can fall to a simpler state at any point. And the simplest state is just spaces. After that, there's a mode I call bubbles, which is periods, lowercase o's, uppercase o's. You can't really read these out loud. And as it becomes more complex, you get up to the names, the scientific and chemical names of these compounds that are toxins, which have verbal beauty to them, although what they indicate, of course, is deeply problematic for us. And so even though giving voice to those names becomes part of the project and part of the performance, they are meant to be illegible, they're esoteric, they're scientific. And the project is really about language that is, for many reasons, very difficult to grasp.
I was also really interested in the way working with text, it could work visually. Here are the O's you can see that form in a way like breathing symbols, the airs, we're trying to bubble. And they form, in this case, a kind of horizon line in a 360 experience that runs around you. Elements just to be in the shoot off, pollutants float away from that horizon line. And in the course of the performance, we move from above the horizon below. And a lot of it was filmed underwater. And we filmed in the way the waves taking over. And you'd be moving above and below this line until the floods take over. And you're completely within this strange, murky world. But it's like in a psychological space, one in which all of these nostalgic elements come bubbling up, crashing through. And in the experience we did it live in the performance setting, we had audience members mingle with the musicians. And as they went from screen to screen that were all back on stage, it became like a human wave. So they get caught up themselves in this movement of time, the text projected on them, the chemical names projected on them, the beacons, the lights of lighthouses, and they're all caught up in this experience as if they're themselves part of more part of the problem, part of the water, part of the crisis, and they can't escape it. It works both an installation model and performance, unique in the performance setting. And so some members would be outside watching, others would be in with the musicians. There'd be singers who were singing in three different languages also, and chanting above this mix of trombones, which were like the ship horns, and bass and electronics, all working in different patterns, spinning through the images. As I said, we then took that down and created short mobile experiences. And the mobile experiences, we then layered on this actual locations where these were set. So you begin in what seems like a natural setting, and then you're thrown into this other world, and then you come back in a way to this setting, but as it were, transformed. So it tries to make a bridge between what's local and what's happening, you know, down by the water, and to try and make a connection to feel that you're not so safe here on a college campus. It's all part of a common experience. We need to, in a way, address these things simultaneously. So we've now come to the end of our session, and we invite you to look at the works in more detail on the two project websites. You'll find 3 Rails Live, Toxicity, and Penelope on the crchange.net site. You can find out more about the Altering Shores at unknownterritories.org. Thank you.
Look forward to your questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Welcome everyone to ICEA 2020 Online. My name is Marc-André Cossette, and thank you for attending this panel session, Human Collaboration and Machine Generation Across Media. We just watched a fascinating presentation, and we're now jumping into Q&A session with Roderick Coover, Nick Montfort, and Scott Rettberg. Welcome, and thank you for participating in this live discussion. So before we start, let me just formally introduce you to our presenter. So Roderick Coover is the creator of interactive, experimental, and emergent cinema, virtual reality, and digital art that are internationally exhibited, and his publication include, amongst other, the books, The Digital Imagery, Literature, and Cinema of the Database, and with Thomas, Bart Shearer. Did I pronounce that?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. And Switching Code, Thinking Through Digital Technology in the Humanities and the Arts. He's a professor of film and media art at the Temple University, Philadelphia, and he lives in the USA and in France. Welcome, Roderick. Our next presenter is Nick Montfort. He's a professor of digital media at MIT. He lives in New York and directs a lab studio called the Trope Tank. His computer-generated books include #! The Collaboration 2x6, Autopia, and The True List with Golem forthcoming. Amongst his digital projects are collaboration with the Deletionist, See and Spar Between, and Renderings. He has 6 books out from the MIT Press, most recently The Future, a second edition of Explanatory Programming for the Arts and the Humanities, is forthcoming from MIT Press. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Scott Rettberg, professor of digital culture in the Department of Linguistic, Literary, and Aesthetic Studies at the University of Bergen, Norway. Rettberg is the author and co-author of novel-length works of electronic literature, combinatorial poetry, and film, including The Unknown, Kind of Blue, Implementation, Frequency, the Catastrophe Trilogy, 3 Rail Lives, and Toxicity that we saw a sample of in this presentation, Hearts and Mind, The Integration Projects, and others. His creative work have been exhibited both online and at art venues, including the Venice Biennale, Santa Monica Museum in Barcelona, the Innova Gallery, ROM 8, the Chemical Heritage Foundation, the Beal Center, Slot Foundation, and the Cranert Art Museum, only to name a few. So thank you for joining us, Scott.
Thank you.
Just a quick reminder for all of you attending this Q&A session. If you have questions for any of our presenters today, you can use the chat section of this page, and I'll make sure to address as many questions as possible within our time limit. So without further delay, let's jump right in with a first roundtable open question to everyone. So in your opening statement from the presentation, you state that you developed computer tools to manipulate symbols and tell your stories. You're also relying on your own human sentience to develop visions that you qualified as machinic. How did working with computers in that way influenced your own vision and sensibility as artists? And maybe you could start with Roderick.
Sure, I'm happy to start off with this. My work grows from being out in the environment and trying to use tools to see environments in different ways. So a lot of this imagery is recorded that are in Toxicity and Three Rails Live, from being out on kayaks in the Delaware estuary, doing long walks. So I've walked around the entire shore of Kent in England, up and down large parts of the shores of Delaware and New Jersey. And so there's a process here of really trying to use tools to open up how I see the environment and to get a sense of space and movement in the environment. And I think a part of it is layering text and mapping and using GIS tools on location as I'm filming. Another part, I think, is working with interactivity. It's something I've always been kind of interested in, expanding the film editor's logic, because film editing itself is very interactive, moving clips around, connecting them. How to bring that to a creative process that expands that brings in chance, brings in surprise, kind of breaks up the routines of documentary structure that I find kind of tedious. And at the same time using layering to break up verisimilitude, to break through what is a sense of a surface visual surrounding that seems unified, to pull out different parts of that image, to give different parts resonance, so that we begin to see the parts that are in a way we're blinded to by the experience of the whole. And I think that's true working with film, and even more with VR, where there's this initial overwhelming sense of verisimilitude, is actually using these computer tools to break that up, and then to find portals, to find links, and it allows us in a way to create movements we wouldn't have made before. And I think lastly, I to say is the computing allows for kind of collaboration that didn't happen before. It's also been really key in this process, working with Nick, Scott in Norway, with the composers, is that there's this constant back and forth where the here and now, the experience of just where you are, is also the somewhere else at the same time. We exchange all of these works that are created across vast spaces, sending material back and forth. There's not a pre-written script, a pre-written arc, any of that stuff that comes with normal filmmaking. Instead, it's all this constant back and forth that is only possible through these collaborative tools of new media.
Thank you. Next, Nick or Scott?
Well, so I want to definitely amplify what Rod just mentioned about collaboration. It can occur without use of the computer medium, and we've all engaged in some projects, some collaborations, where we don't lean as heavily as we do today on the networking aspects of a computer. For me, computation and language are the mediums of art in which I work. So it's obvious, I suppose, that these are our formal mediums. We think about language as, if we are going to look at written representations of language, as sequences of glyphs. We think about it as something that can be parsed and treated formally in various ways. And then we think about computation as, for instance, being constituted of computer programs that have digital representations and have a particular operational semantics. But these are also material, both computing and language. And so my engagement with these is a way to get at that materiality as well, to make things happen in ways that highlight the material experience of computing over time, having processes that cause the computer to slow down, pushing things too far to be legible, and highlighting the aspects of the visual display that make it evident that it's a material system rather than a seamless and purely formal type of system. So those are things. Definitely the collaborative potential of these systems is very significant, but also not only their formal aspects, but their material aspects as well, that engage me as an artist and that I try to explore.
Yeah, so for me as a storyteller, one of the things that was really exciting about the computer when I first started using it with fiction in the 1990s was that it made a lot of connections for me between things that I was seeing in postmodern fiction, where we're working with nonlinear structures and different types of fragmentation, and thinking about ways to tell a story that's not sort of always from beginning to end, but includes some kind of variance within it. And then thinking about that sort of contrast between a database and narrative as we typically think of it. And, you know, people like Lev Manovich saying that databases and narratives are sort of contrary to each other. So ways to kind of work against the grain with that, and then see what can become of it. To echo what Nick and Rod said, collaboration is sort of essential to my practice, and collaborating with these two guys has been one of the joys of my life. But also when I first encountered the network, it was suddenly that, writing can be a kind of lonely process. But when you're creating together with a group of people with different perspectives and different skills and different sort of media orientations, that's very exciting. And then the last thing I'd say is, generativity in itself, the ways that we can use these sort of semi-randomized structures. Because when you're creating a poetry generator or a generative film, you get back in a way more than you put into it. You sort of create this system, and then the system gives you different versions of a story, perhaps than the one that you originally thought of. And then kind of thinking through the poetic uses of that is very interesting to me.
Thank you all. Already a lot to think about. Sorry, I spiked the mic a little bit. So I'm going to use actually, Scott, what you said about the importance of the collaboration with your colleagues to segue to a question from the public, actually. So the question here is, what strategies do you use to navigate the international collaboration between humans and algorithms? Because I think you, Scott, are in Norway, and Nick and Roderick are in the US. So I mean, this must be difficult to build a collaboration at such long distance.
Well, part of the key to our success in the past has been airplanes. so we did try to over the course of these collaborations get together in person at various stages of them. But of course, we have the network and we have the ability to sort of set some ideas out together and then work on them over time in an iterative process. Where we're kind of exchanging materials, and especially when we're sort of moving across image and text, Rod will send me a basket of images and I'll send him back a set of texts, and then he'll respond to those texts and send more images, and I'll respond back and forth. And then of course, yeah, as I said before, the algorithms also play a part in this. Like with toxicity, we've done a number of different arrangements and different versions of that work and tried it out in different ways. Maybe we're emphasizing the voices of certain characters at certain times, or with Three Rails Live. we change the structure and the way that you experience the film over time, in a way kind of collaborating with the algorithm and seeing what it's giving back to us, and then changing the algorithm as we go.
I would agree with the importance of the mix of the in-person and the electronic communication systems. That, to begin with, to create works, nothing happens without getting together and talking over projects, having a beer, letting them digest. There's a lot of working apart, sending back stuff back and forth, but having continual little shows or experiences is really key to get together, see how it's working, and then work again. But in many cases too, there's an intensive period where you then get together for a week, whether it was, I remember Barcelona the week before we did toxicity there, and transform the work to get it to a new stage. And you need to be testing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And sometimes that it's helpful to do that in person. Three Rails Live was created mostly iteratively, but it happened partly because we were on this train to begin with. And the train rides were key because we were presenting both in Philadelphia and in Providence. And the fact that working with database works is that you want to continually can be changing the code, adjusting what's in the database, adding material. And so the actual experience is the actual coming together for show and saying, wow, how did that work? Means that the thing gets worked through again, which I suppose in the end requires more than anything a lot of patience, because these things don't come together singly at one moment in a simple arc. Actually, there's a process which is really great. It's something I love much more than traditional film approach. And the database brings that. It always surprises you. The database throws stuff back that you didn't expect, the combinations you never thought of, and then say, wow, we better add some more along this theme or that theme. And it takes seeing that play out together and talking about it in a way to go back into our separate processes.
So a mix of synchronous and asynchronous workflow. And I guess in these strange times we're living in right now, you're like all of us, multiplying the Zoom calls to replace the plane. Nick, did you want to add something?
Sure. I did. I wanted to add a few things. Matthew, this is a good question. And it's, of course, we point out that, yes, not only planes, but trains and other means of getting together in person are very important. I don't think there's a substitute for in-person communication, and not just in-person communication, but really working together and jamming together. We could think about it as a sort of corporate or collective sort of workflow analogy, but you can also think about it as like a duo or a band that's rehearsing and jamming together and developing projects, developing ideas, and letting that happen in a bottom-up way. And for that, it's very important to be together in person. I also wanted to, I guess, from my standpoint, I don't collaborate with algorithms. And in fact, I don't even consider myself to use algorithms. I wouldn't say that I use algorithms as a medium of my work. I would be more specific and say I use code, because algorithms is a particular sort of entirely formal view of computation. It doesn't get at the fact that there's a particular implementation and a particular programming language written a certain way. So a work of mine, Round, which computes the digits of pi as it runs, it has no internal store of data. It computes these digits one by one, and it produces a sort of textualization, a mapping of the digits of pi to an infinite set of verses. That project exists both in JavaScript form and Python form, and those are different. They have different possibilities of running in a browser or not. The Python program is much simpler, easier to explore, modify, play with, expand because of Python support for infinite size integers. So there's I guess two assumptions that for me personally in my practice I wouldn't follow through on. I wouldn't describe myself as a collaborator with either code or algorithms, and I would look at the particular materialities of code rather than talking about the algorithm more abstractly when I think about my own work. So that's where I come from, but there are certainly aspects of process in which, as Scott and Rod have both said, we are surprised by what happens when we put things together, and computation doesn't always do what we expect. So there is feedback, there is provocation, and there is response that we have.
Nick's a computer scientist, so he doesn't believe in magic.
Well, thank you for bringing that point. I think it's a very, very important point. Very important to mention that different programming language have different strengths and different capacities that impacts definitely the result product. And looking actually at the sample you presented from 3 Rails Live, one could imagine clear relations between the narrative text and the images that are shown on the screen. But then you explained in the presentation the combinatory structures that you used for the piece and how the images and narratives and preverbs were put together in a kind of arbitrary way out of buckets. And this arbitrary coupling generates actually new meaning for the viewer. Would you consider in that case that the meaning is emerging when the viewer is confronted with the piece, actually?
Well, I think there's two things that happen there. One is that, when I started writing the narrative fragments, they were completely separate at the time that I was writing them. But as you write more of them, sort of naturally you begin to think in narrative terms and to connect these chunks of narrative together. And then there's the quality of closure. So when we bring in Nick's perverbs, and when we have this sort of simultaneously yoking together of image and text, our brains sort of naturally do this. And I think it's sort of core to the nature of humans as kind of narrative beings, is that we take an image and a text together and we create meaning from that. When we have a title and we see some images and some text afterwards, we yoke those things together. And when we have a perverb that's at the end of 2 narrative fragments, we somehow think that that's giving us an ending. But there is this sort of boundedness to the body of material overall that's there in any case.
I think that was there in the very process too, along with writing, with the image making. At first, we did kind of have some keywords. We thought these things might have been more tightly bound. I shot sets of smokestacks on the water side, sets of flood waters from one or another hurricane coming through, all various sets of work, drains and drain pipes, kids on swings, different things that were all part of sets. And then actually those became very rich to actually pull those keywords away and see what happened to these sets, which were from a previous logic structure. Then you pull away that structure, but there's something there behind them. And that's the wonderful thing of the mind, right? Of how we gather these, we hold on to things that we're not sure how they will resonate, but they all had at some point some meaning that we held on to them too. So the kind of fundamental logic and the breaking up of the relationship between the actual object and the content of the story, the threads of the story. We don't do work that is dreamlike, but there's something about how the mind works with dreams where on one hand, you have structure, but you also have substitutions and displacements and strange mixes. And in a way, this process opens up these aspects of the mind of how we grasp for meaning in odd places that actually we find it there because it's all part of the total world experience we have. And there's this kind of strange gathering and displacement and gathering. So then other elements come in, like the dice roll, the chance element, other visual elements that try and also trigger that, essentially, like being on a train ride, the train sounds that come up now and again that gather those together.
Yes, the sort of fundamental idea in narrative, the fallacy of post hoc, propter hoc, comes into play with, for instance, the text that Scott has written that can appear in any order. We assume that one that we hear after another must have been caused by the previous one. That's this natural assumption. But even in an ordinary text that's not being combinatorially arranged, that's not necessarily the case. It's just an assumption that we make. So that's played upon. And then I would say the way that the framing of the combinatory titles and the pre-combined perverb morals at the end adds to that is something, I'll just coin this phrase right here. I just checked, it doesn't exist anywhere on the web. And it's a horrible mix of Greek and Latin also. I call it parahoc, propter hoc, in reference to Gerard Genet's notion of what's called the paratext from Le Solil. The idea that these sorts of texts that are beyond the core text, things like the title, right, have a strong influence. They offer a control over how we read something and how we receive something. Right? So when we give something a different paratext, we therefore think that the work, if I issue something under a different title, I could have come up with that title randomly, but we're going to be struggling to imagine that that work has something to do with the title under which I just issued it. These are some of the invitations that we make to the reader's imagination, the viewer's imagination in a work like this. And they may accept that invitation or not, but we intend for it to be offering rich possibilities for those who view this.
Thank you. We're going to go back to the chat question. There was one question during the presentation about Penelope. So the question reads, does Penelope generate a new sonnet and a new video sequence each time it is run? Or is what we saw the finalized edit of Penelope based on curated combinatory generation of text, video, and sound? And I guess what I mean is the goal to have a Penelope generator or a generated Penelope?
Well, it does recombine differently every single time that it runs. So the juxtaposition of images, of text, and of soundtrack are created anew every time. The way that it actually runs as a program is it produces 3 of these doubled sonnets, which are actually, it goes backwards in structure at the couplet at the very end. So it actually it's sort of a sonnet, but it's a sonnet that winds and unwinds itself. So yes, it could produce many different versions of that sonnet or sets of sonnets.
It's also there's a very lovely feature that after it's gone through and made its full piece, takes about 5 minutes to make one whole poem. It puts up that poem, and there it is, recorded on its time, and then the whole system refreshes. So, if you sit through at least 3 viewings of the work, you really get a sense of the range of how you keep coming up with these every 5 minutes, another new poem, and it encourages people to stay for much longer because each time all of these large amount of material gets drawn from. There's constant change and shifting, so that there's similar images pop up in such different contexts on each time, but then also you end up with a full poem after each show. So it's actually disappointing to only show it once. It's three times to sort of a minimum to start getting into the experience. And there the images are really tied to the different thematic elements very closely. And you see those themes kind of work through over the course of several poems.
Thank you.
Yeah, and of course, in a way, these things sort of never, in a way, that the process kind of never ends. Both that there's this kind of almost not infinite, but large body of possibilities. But also, you know, we can come back to that work, and that's been something that we've done with a lot of our projects, is come back and swap out elements. I've thought of, for instance, having many different women voice the poem, and just that changing that element of how the voice actor would work would create a completely different version of the piece.
So in the word of Matthew in the chat, basically it's a Penelope generator, not a generated Penelope. Next, actually, I was really fascinated by Nick's intervention on the transformative units of language, and you touched a little bit on that when you talked about the titles and the use of I made a mistake earlier, I said proverbs, but it's perverbs, to give a certain orientation to the interpretation one does to the image and the narrative that are presented, especially in Three Brailles Live. How would you say the use of the perverbs change the interpretation differently than maybe simpler units of language, like when you gave the example, the glass example in the presentation?
Yes, I think that there's a context that's established by the title in a certain way. It's something that is abstract, it's general, it's not something that the piece is literally about. And then by offering this sort of moral of the story, so this is a fairly retrograde notion. It's as if we were going to wrap up what are rather open-ended types of ruminations, perspectives that are offered by these texts, by the evocative motion pictures and still images that go along with them. And so it's a little bit of a intentionally perfunctory gesture. But nevertheless, we try to make a connection to something that is cultural wisdom, that's cultural knowledge that something is telling us. And when we hear these types of sometimes truncated or sometimes mixed up proverbs, the perverb, those are these remnants of ways of thinking in a primary oral culture that are now coming through manuscript culture, coming through print culture, in electronic and digital culture, and being transformed in this unusual way, and hopefully activating, I hope, rather than trivializing the rest of the project in these ways, so that if you know, the glass house is something that relates to someone looking out in a sky car. It relates to things that are going on in the piece, and it also relates to the examination of personal life and topics of the narrative and things like this. So they're meant to be, again, invitations to connect. Sometimes the connection may be too difficult to make, and they may come off being not very good invitations, but they are hopefully having those aspects underneath them, and they function effectively at times.
Thank you. Now, just to follow up, maybe talk about the second piece that you showed, toxicity. And in that piece, you use speculative narrative to explore the question of climate change. And this is an open question to all of you, but how does the speculative narrative inform us on pressing matters like climate change? And also, what was your primary objective when using this method for creating the film?
Shall I start and then
Yep.
turn it on? So the initial project came around with an invitation from the Chemical Heritage Foundation, which was then Chemical Sciences Museum in Philadelphia, for a show they were doing called Sensing Change. And the concern there was how to use the arts to bring to widen the discourse on climate change, and the need to reach people's imagination in different ways to make the issues of climate change resonate. And so the task of the stories, in a way, is part of it for me, was how to open up the imaginary. And there's this kind of idea of as if people were telling oral histories from a future, but it could be any kind of future, because in a way, the combinatorial structure, the stories could go this way or that way, this way or that way. And that's the kind of imaginary space for dealing with the different threats of climate change that I thought would be really valuable, to have people imagine what ifs, various what ifs, and Scott ran with this, with the what ifs. New Jersey became a toxic wasteland, and then no one could go there anymore, which is quite reasonable. What if there were mass cancer sites? I was exploring in the research before what happened with the flooding of nuclear power plants along the Delaware that are of the same kind that as the kind were destroyed during the tsunami in Japan. What happened if mass floods affected those? Usually one disaster comes with others. Well, can you imagine what happens if the floods cause toxic leaks, ships to crash, other things that can happen in those instances? Actually did happen later in the Houston hurricane. And so, in a way, speculating on that opens people's imaginations to, I hope, engage with the topic and have the real consequences of the way people die during such hurricanes, for one, and then speculating on other ways, deaths to follow, things like cancers, again, pushes people, I hope, to engage in a kind of collective mind, imaginary that is their part of the story. And they might perhaps feel as they go to these places, the future weighing in on the present and maybe shaping choices.
Yeah, I think in a way we're kind of, when we're working on these sorts of projects, we're always like speculating 10 minutes into the future. But the last significant piece of writing I did for a media art project was right after the virus began to spread in Wuhan. I started a piece that was about, well, what would happen if this virus spread around the world? How would we react? And which I stopped writing because it actually happened. But I think one of the powers of new media and of the database structure is that it allows us to look at a wide array of impacts and phenomena without necessarily putting them together into one single coherent vision of how they fit together. And that's because we actually encounter these events as, what the philosopher Timothy Morton would call sort of hyper objects, these phenomena that are kind of too large that they don't really fit into a human time scale. Things like climate change or cancer or radiation, that we sort of tend to consciously put them off and avoid them. So when we take things into a database, we can then sort of replicate the experience or sort of speculate on how the different elements of this experience are appearing to us phenomenologically, and then maybe get the distance from it to begin to think about how to change the various factors that are causing these things.
Nick, did you want to add something to the topic of? Well, we're gonna jump into the next question then. Essentially, the generative structures and all the pieces that you presented are quite different. It's going to be a very short question. How do you negotiate that generative structure when you start a new project?
Well, I'll just say something real quick on that. Is that there's the idea of the sort of objective correlative of how a given structure can appeal to the poetic intent of a piece. So one of the things that we've done as we've been working on these projects is just kind of coming up with new ideas that are unrelated to the current project, and thinking about, well, this structural idea is very interesting. But we kind of then, when we begin to deal with the topics, that's when we begin to make the connections and think about, all right, how does this story work if it fits into this rearranged box that's different from the way that we set up the last music box.
The conditions of putting the pieces on also part of this. We had quite different setups. In some cases, toxicity, as I mentioned, developed for long experience in immersive gallery settings, often big projection. We gave us space to make works that would sustain over that. Altering shores, we had this double element, but the first format was a large live projection experience. That sets a kind of range of how much room the code can go through its unfolding and developing, and how we can really let that play. The conditions of working in VR with distortions of text, and the importance of working with the horizon line became a very interesting metaphor, but it's also driven by the technology and the conditions of projection. So the final output did echo back in several cases. Working with how that would be on the headset was very different from working in the large environments. And so we had a lot of different sort of, thinking of outcome, thinking of audience experience, thinking of how would one follow a story. So that we actually had to try out a lot of things and then shift and change them. And this was certainly true with Toxicity and Three Rails. They went through, we adapted in very different ways. It was really interesting trying out, say, Toxicity from one character's perspective or another in some shows, because there was a sort of space and time to do that, versus having to squeeze within a single showing model where it would generate just once, and wanting therefore to feel like you touched all the elements in a different way. So output affected how we go back and do the structuring in some cases.
And speaking of the shorter version, focusing on specific characters, what's your strategy when starting from a 45-minute piece and reducing it to 10-minute? Do you do a more traditional edits, or you edit the buckets and then let the process generate a new type of content?
You essentially just edit the code and say select from these arrays rather than those arrays. So select from them in this order rather than that order. And it can be, it's a very kind of simple way of making pretty complex edits in a way to a piece.
And it really kept the way Scott did that in that case of Toxicity, really kept still a sense of character surprise, because it wasn't just doing all of one character, it was tilting the percentages. So every third time we go to a narrative, as it were, but not even that precise, the percentage chances will come back to one character more often than the others. So that voice, just by hearing that voice, we had 6 actors reading the voices there, kept tilt your direction to one perspective over the others, and starts to see that as the dominant voice. But it kept the surprise going all the way through. And I mean, we have almost 2 hours worth of back material there that it's drawing from. So there's lots of different ways that this can play out to tell the story.
Definitely. We have Paula from the chat that was wondering if your collaboration was sponsored in any way, and if that would have an influence of the topics you can cover, or the way that you cover certain topics.
We have to work with very little chunks of money in different places, little invitations, and in fact working with a database structure, separating sound from image, separating it allows for an awful lot of flexibility and incremental construction, which is very necessary. It's very different from, say, putting together studio production where there's a lot of upfront costs. And there's a lot of, I think, bit by bit working along.
Sound effects.
Yeah, as a poet.
Generative.
As a poet, there's no financial side really for me. But I could sort of answer the question hypothetically. You know, what if there were? I mean, it would probably be in the form of fellowship support, and it would probably be for individual project work, because that's the type of support that is awarded. So actually trying to do these projects in a more ad hoc way is one of the things that allows for this collaboration across different practices, where, you know, Rod comes from more visual perspective, Scott from fiction, myself from poetry, all of us working with code and combination. And this type of collaboration, or these different types of collaborations. Yeah, from my standpoint, that's, you know, not having any money offered to you allows you the freedom to pursue different types of projects.
And we do get, like, you know, I got sabbatical funding that let me go over to the States for an extended period, and that helped a lot with toxicity. But also I would say, you know, generosity and friendship are two very essential components here. One is we're willing to put in our time, but also a lot of our projects have depended upon, you know, other artists who, you know, who we know, who are friends and want to do something because it's interesting or cool, and, you know, voice actors who we try to pay actors when we can, but, you know, at a very minimal resources. We've certainly put together a number of films that have been way under the budgets that you would typically expect for that type of product.
Often the biggest challenges in some cases are works that are designed for very big projection formats, and the actual cost of putting them on, or that element is one area where you know, you often wait for the chance to put on, very difficult chance to fund these things that require large formats or immersive formats in that technical stage. This was something true with another project Scott and I worked on called Hearts and Minds, designed for large format caves from 360 Cinema, and for Altering Shores, the project with Nick, also has that circumstance. But we have luckily had the invitations back and forth to get together, which is also really key. And that's also part of the incremental process. And for me, filming, it requires actually getting out and going places. But it's being able to have a structure that allows to build bit by bit and to get together, as Scott mentioned, the generosity of others to gather, to try things out, and to bring different people in different parts of the collaborations, to kind of extend the collaborations, is something that this way of working is really great. It's very different from the money-heavy film industry's approach.
Right, and it is often the case with, you were talking about immersive displays and multi-display installation, how sometimes like showing a piece could be more expensive than producing it at some point. And I guess you touched on another important point with collaboration is the importance of friendship and, I guess, respect between all you three when you create together, and the contacts you have with other artists. That is important. We have about 4 minutes left. I had so many questions that I wanted to ask you, and maybe in one quick sentence, I don't want to get too much out of the way, but there's a clear theme of water, of fluidity in the text, especially in Altering Shore. Where does that interest come from in maybe one quick sentence?
For me, it's not a quick sentence, but I grew up on English Channel, and then I've lived in different coastal places. I do a lot of boating. I did a piece on the Colorado River, kayaking down, boating down on Colorado, following histories that way. I've always been interested in the sound and rhythms and sentience related to water. is one of many issues here, along with pollution and toxicity. But for one sentence, let's say that.
Thank you.
I would say that water is both this sort of fundamentally elemental force that kind of reconnects us to the sublime. But I also see it like, I go for a walk every day in Bergen, and I take a picture of the same fjord and the same mountain. And for me, it's this sort of moment of relief or calm, just watching the waves lap. So it's something that grounds you, I think.
Thank you.
And I'd say water is, pervasively metaphorical in our treatment and understanding of language. We talk of flow in rap, stream of consciousness in the novel. So those are some of the reasons it connects for me to practice. And also, since we're wrapping up, I'll just say, Marc-Andre, thank you very much for your hosting us and asking these questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great questions.
And well, we're gonna finish on that. We have about a minute and a half left. So for this panel, human collaboration and machine generation across media. For everyone who's watching, make sure you check out our presenters profile on the ICEA 2020 Swap Card app. If you want to know more about their work, connect with them and follow them on social media. You can also visit unknownterritories.org and crchange.net to view projects presented in this presentation. Roderick Coover, Nick Montfort, and Scott Rettberg, thank you for taking the time and for this great discussion. That was amazing. And again, my name is Marc-Andre Cossette. Thank you all for attending, and I wish you a very good rest of your week at ICEA 2020.